Being punished by the gods seem terrifying, but being punished by other humans feel a bit more terrifying. Hi, my name is Jessa. Please join me as we look together top 10 unsettling punishments from ancient Greece. And before we begin, in the last video I was in top 10 messed up dark age punishments, not for the faint of heart. I gave you guys a riddle. The riddle was, what can run but never walk? The answer is water. Your next riddle will be at the end of this video. Anyways, let's get started. Number 10, displaced. Although the idea of exile doesn't seem like an unsettling outcome, but if you lived in ancient Greece, it is for sure something that you might want to be a little nervous about. Just like in Survivor or in any other modern game show, in Athens every year they had a vote if they wanted to kick someone out, and if they voted yes, then an ostracism, which is a little pot, they would actually be held 2 months later, and the citizens would give the name of those that they wished to ostracize to a scribe, as many of them were illiterate, and then they would scratch the name on the pottery shards, and the shards were piled up facing down so the votes would remain anonymous. The person whose pile contained the most ostraca, or basically the most votes, would be banished and would have to sashay away. The person newly ostracized would have 10 days to leave the city, and if he attempted to return, the penalty was death. The property of the man banished was not confiscated, and there was no loss of his status. On some plus side, after 10 years he was actually allowed to return without stigma. Number 9, slavery. In this time they really were pro-slaves. If by any means of punishment you would mean of ending up as a slave, to the ancient Greeks, slaves are after all expected to be loyal to their masters. A slave who ratted out on their masters would then be subsequently convicted and would be put to death for disloyalty. That's why they had to be tormented before a testimony could be taken. Enslaved people who lived and largely worked independently of their masters were those least likely to feel the iron rod of discipline. Athens slaves too could be physically punished or even tormented, and enslaved people elsewhere were also subjected to beatings. Athens alone was home to an estimated 60,000 to 80,000 slaves during the 5th and the 4th century BC, with each household having an average of 3 or 4 enslaved people attached to it. Slaves in ancient Greece did not have any human or civil rights, and they were tormented for different reasons. Their owner could beat them whenever he wanted because he was a jerk, or their testimony was needed for a lawsuit. They were tormented into confessing to their own guilt or incriminate someone else. Number 8, flogging. Yeah, you might be familiar with this one. Flogging, or known as whipping, was also used in ancient Greece. Offenders could be subjected to beatings or implements like a whip or a rod, which were meant to cause pain and severe as a deterrent. For these times, ritual floggings were actually practiced, and heretics were whipped with a thong of oxtail leather or parchment strips. When the cane strikes or objects like these are used, the blood is forced from the tissue beneath. Damages of the small blood vessels and individual cells would cause leakage of blood and tissue fluid into the skin and underlying tissue, increasing the tension in these areas. In ancient Athens, bodily punishments like flogging and whipping were deemed inappropriate for free Athenian men, but were actually more reserved for slaves and foreigners. Number 7, barbecue 2. Yes, I know the whole stick thing, but that's what they did. Like all other forms of punishment, the pike or impalement was the next course of the deal. The victim was inserted halfway up their back privates while held above the spike for longitudinal, and the spike would run them through as the gravity took hold, avoiding vital organs emerging through the skin on the shoulder or neck. For several days a person might endure this. Instead, the torso was penetrated by the stake during transversal, either from the front to the back or other way around. Impalement was a very common practice across the Pharaonic Egypt, Europe, Mesopotamia, and the ancient Near East, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and of course, ancient Greece. Number 6, I believe I can fly. In ancient Greece, another method of execution was the act of throwing a criminal over a precipice. This practice was not limited to Athens, but it was actually very prevalent in other regions like Sparta, Delphi, Corinth, etc. The execution would involve pushing the convict over a high, steep cliff where they would fall into a deep trench known as a varathon in Athens. This particular form of execution was typically reserved for individuals who were convicted of religious or political crimes. The denial of burial rights further added the humiliation and disgrace brought upon the criminal, as they would be left unburied, their remains exposed and vulnerable to the elements, as well as the animals. Reference to this method of execution are not found after 400 BC, and the Athenians appear to have dug a new trench in the 4th century, but this was probably designed to receive convicts who were executed by other means. Number 5, rats. They really do love using rats back in the day, but to be honest, you'd be surprised that they use rats even as recent as 1970s in Chile and Argentina during the Dirty War using the same methods. The method, if some might know, involved trapping rats in a bottomless cage atop a victim's abdomen. Burning coals were then placed on a small tray atop the cage, heating the metal from above. Desperation to escape the heat, the rats would begin to burrow only through the soft surface that they could find, which is the victim's flesh. With sharp claws and teeth, the rats would quickly gnaw their way into the victim's bowels, causing excruciation, pain, and terror. The technique particularly came in handy when, as I mentioned before, the Dutch leaders were trying to extract information from Spanish enemies. As soon as the caged rats replaced place on the prisoner's stomach, the terrified men would often give up and they would actually just expose everything else that they knew. Number 4. Stoning. Stoning or lapidation is a form of capital punishment where a group throws stones at a person until the subject dies from a blunt trauma. It has been attested as a form of punishment from grave misdeeds since ancient times. Stoning is attested in the Near East since ancient times as a form of capital punishment for grave sins. However, stoning as a practice was not geographically limited to only near the East, as it is also a significant historical record of stoning being employed in the West as well. Ancient geographers describe both the elder and younger atrocities being stoned to death in ancient Greece around the 7th century BCE. Stoning is condemned by human rights groups as a form of cruel and unusual punishment and torment as a serious violation of human rights. As of now, human rights organizations argue that many acts targeting of stoning should not be legal in the first place by allowing them interferes with people's rights to private life. Number 3. Brazen Bull. Throughout history, humans in general have created an enclave of many extraordinary things. One of the cruelest punishments invented in ancient Greece, this particular type of torment was just as pleasant as everything else on this list, or rather unpleasant. The Brazen Bull was just that of a sculpture of a bull with a fire built underneath it. The victim was placed inside and slowly roasted to death as the fire burned and the metal grew hotter and hotter. I'm pretty sure you can imagine the pain of the victims that they were in, so that the creators of the Brazen Bull would just enjoy it. The bull was casted hollow and was used with a fire built below, and it was designed so that it could be opened and a person would be forced inside. As I mentioned, the fire would start underneath and the person would be burnt as the smoke and steam would escape through the nose. Incense was also placed inside to counteract the smell of burning flesh, and it is said that the series of tubes inside the statue was designed to distort the screams of the victims to make it sound like an animal. Once the individual had succumbed into their charred state, apparently the people there would also use their bones and turn them into bracelets. Number 2. The rack. The rack was a torment device consisting of a rectangular frame with a roller at each end. The victim's limbs were stretched and tied to the rollers. By turning the rollers, the body would be subjected to increasing tension, causing extreme pain and potential dislocation or dismemberment of their joints. The exact origin of the rack is pretty unclear, but the earliest mention of its use was in ancient Greece. The rack was often used as a torment method to extract confession, with the execution itself coming anyway from another method. Nevertheless, victims would perish on the rack, and for those who did not, it was far more likely more painful for the persecutor to the method of actual execution. The most infamous case of the rack as used in ancient Greece was associated with Herostratus, an arsonist who was set on fire to the second temple of Artemis in Ephesus in 356 BC. Finally, number 1. Crucifixion. This form of execution was mostly associated with the death of Jesus, was rather practiced in ancient Greece, but there is at least one mention in the historical text of the Greeks condemning someone to this slow and excruciating death. According to the Greek writer Herodotus in his histories, there's an account of the execution of a Persian general by the Athenians around 479 BC. The Persians had burned Athens just a year prior in 480 BC, so the harsh punishment may have reflected the intense anger of the Greeks. In any case, Herodotus wrote that they nailed him to a plank and hung him, and this, as you know, is a form of crucifixion. So, what was your favorite on the list, and did you learn anything? Let me know. And for your next riddle, are you ready? What breaks every day but can never be fixed? Be sure to put your answer in the comments below, and I'll really answer in the next video. Top 10 unsettling war punishments not for the faint at heart. Alright, that's all for today. Thank you for joining me. My name is Jessa. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see your beautiful faces in the next one. Bye.